The cool blast of air conditioning greeted customers as they entered Parkview Grocery, a small but bustling supermarket on the edge of town. The automatic doors slid open and shut with a soft hiss, allowing in a steady stream of shoppers going about their day. The smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the sharp scent of cleaning solution, a signature of a well-maintained store. Among the customers was Melanie Carter, a woman in her mid-30s with deep brown skin, wearing a casual yet elegant summer dress. Her daughter, Sophie, no older than 16, walked beside her, eyes glued to her phone, occasionally glancing up to check their surroundings. It was a routine shopping trip, nothing out of the ordinary, or so it seemed. Melanie pushed their cart down the aisles, checking off items from a neatly folded grocery list. They had spent the morning running errands, and the grocery store was their last stop before heading home. Sophie, who had been half listening to her mom's requests, suddenly looked up from her phone. "Can we get some of that new oat milk?" she asked, pointing towards the dairy section. Melanie nodded absently, focused on finding the best deal on pasta. "Sure, grab it if you want." Sophie wandered off toward the refrigerated shelves while her mother continued shopping. As she scanned the shelves for a specific brand of marinara sauce, she noticed something odd. A middle-aged woman behind the checkout counter, Nancy Whitmore, according to her name tag, had been watching her. Not the usual polite glance store clerks gave to customers, but something more scrutinizing. Her eyes followed Melanie's movements with a sharp, assessing gaze, lips pressed into a thin line. Melanie was used to this. She had encountered enough judgmental stares in her lifetime to recognize them immediately. She sighed quietly and continued shopping, willing herself to ignore it. As she placed a few items in the cart and moved toward the checkout, Nancy's expression hardened. She shifted her weight behind the counter, clearing her throat loudly as Melanie approached. "Can I help you?" Nancy's voice was clipped cool. Melanie offered a polite smile. "Just checking out, thanks." Nancy barely nodded, her eyes darting towards Sophie, who had just returned with the oat milk. The girl set it in the cart and gave her mother a questioning look, sensing something was off. Nancy scanned the items one by one, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were expecting to find something amiss. Then, just as Melanie reached in her purse for her wallet, Nancy abruptly stopped. Her hand hovered over a pack of organic blueberries. She lifted them up and squinted as if examining a hidden flaw. Then, in a voice loud enough for nearby customers to hear, she said, "These aren't ringing up." "Did you?" She paused, eyes flicking to Melanie's face. "Actually get these from the shelf?" Melanie stiffened. Sophie's head snapped up. "Yes," Melanie said, keeping her tone even. "They were in the fresh produce section, right where they always are." Nancy pursed her lips. "Huh, weird. It's just that sometimes people, pick things up without scanning them properly." She gave a knowing glance, a half-smirk curling at the edges of her mouth. A few nearby customers turned their heads. The air in the store shifted, subtle but undeniable. Melanie felt her stomach tighten, but she refused to take the bait. "You can check the cameras," she said calmly. Nancy gave a little chuckle, shaking her head as if amused. "Oh, I'm not saying anything happened, hon. Just being extra cautious." The word hon dripped with condescension. Sophie clenched her fists, her phone now forgotten in her pocket. She knew what this was. She had read about it, seen videos of incidents just like this online. And now, here it was playing out in front of her. Melanie took a slow breath, keeping her expression neutral. "Can you just finish scanning my items, please?" Nancy shrugged, still smirking. "Sure thing." The tension thickened. A man behind them shifted uncomfortably. A woman at the next register cast a quick, sympathetic glance before looking away. No one said anything. Nancy's fingers danced over the register as she finished scanning the groceries. But before Melanie could swipe her card, Nancy did something unexpected. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for only Melanie and Sophie to hear. "You people get real sensitive, don't you?" she murmured. Melanie froze. Sophie's breath hitched. A beat of silence passed. Then, before Melanie could say a word, Sophie stepped forward. Eyes blazing, voice steady, she spoke. and what she said next would leave the entire store stunned. The air in the grocery store felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. The soft hum of scanning machines and distant chatter faded as Sophie stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't just angry, she was furious. "What did you just say?" Sophie's voice was clear, cutting through the subtle murmur of the checkout lanes. Nancy blinked, her smirk faltering for the briefest moment. But she recovered quickly, shrugging with a false innocence. "I didn't mean anything by it, sweetheart. Just saying people get awfully touchy about the smallest things these days." Melanie, who had been carefully controlling her emotions, placed a gentle hand on Sophie's arm, silently urging her to let it go. This wasn't new to her. She had been through enough to know how these moments played out. But Sophie wasn't like her mother. She wasn't conditioned to accept this kind of treatment as part of life. Sophie's jaw clenched, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "The smallest things?" she repeated. "You accuse my mom of stealing. You look her up and down like she didn't belong here. And now you're acting like she's the problem." A few customers pretended not to hear, eyes flicking back to their carts, while others subtly lingered, drawn to the brewing confrontation. A cashier at the next register, a young woman with wide eyes, glanced nervously between Nancy and the growing scene. Nancy exhaled dramatically, placing her hands on her hips. "Oh, come on. I was just doing my job. If I don't double-check, people will say I'm not being careful enough. Besides, you don't have to make a scene." Sophie let out a sharp laugh, disbelief flashing across her face. "Oh, we're making a scene?" she shot back. "You just humiliated my mom in front of everyone, and now you want us to stay quiet?" Melanie touched her daughter's arm again, this time with a little more insistence. But Sophie wasn't finished. "I bet if we looked at the security footage," she continued, voice unwavering, "we'd see that you don't double-check every customer, just the ones that look like us." A ripple went through the small crowd that had now formed. The implication was unmistakable. A few heads nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, as though suddenly forced to acknowledge something they'd rather ignore. Nancy's expression darkened, her smug demeanor cracking just slightly. "Now, that's not fair," she said, her tone sharp. "I treat everyone the same." Sophie folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. "Really? So if I came in here alone, dressed like I do, with my hair like this, you'd treat me exactly the same as some preppy white girl with a designer bag?" Nancy's mouth opened, but no words came out. That hesitation, that split second where she had no answer, was all Sophie needed. The silence in the store grew heavier. Nancy forced out a small, tight laugh, trying to regain control. "You're just looking for something to be offended about." Sophie's eyes burned with frustration. "No," she said firmly. "We're tired of pretending this doesn't happen. We're tired of people like you acting like we're the problem when all we want to do is exist without being treated like criminals." Nancy scoffed, looking around as if searching for support. "Oh, please. I'm not racist." The words sounded empty, defensive. No one stepped in to back her up. The young cashier at the next register bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The bystanders who had witnessed everything now had a choice: to look away or acknowledge the truth unfolding before them. One man, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat. "I've been coming here for years," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And I have noticed you treat people differently." Nancy's head snapped toward him, eyes widening. "Excuse me?" He gestured vaguely around the store. "I've never seen you question anyone else's groceries before. Not like this." Another customer, a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair, hesitated before adding, "I've seen it too." Nancy's face flushed. For the first time, it seemed like she was realizing she might not be able to talk her way out of this one. Melanie, who had been silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but firm. "I came here to buy groceries, just like everyone else. I didn't ask for this, but this is what happens over and over again. And people like you think we're just supposed to accept it." Nancy crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Look, I was just doing my job. If you don't like it, you can take your business elsewhere." Sophie's eyes gleamed with determination. "Oh, don't worry. We will." And with that, she reached in her pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen. Nancy's brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" Sophie didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned the phone toward the growing crowd, the screen glowing bright. A recording. From the moment Nancy had accused Melanie of not paying for the blueberries, Sophie had been recording everything. A few gasps rippled through the small crowd. Nancy's face drained of color. Melanie looked at her daughter with both surprise and admiration. Sophie had done something she had never been able to bring herself to do. She had refused to let this moment pass unnoticed. Nancy's lips parted as if to say something, but Sophie didn't give her the chance. "This is going online," Sophie said simply, "and we'll see if your store still wants you representing them after this." The weight of those words settled over the room. The moment was no longer just about Melanie or Nancy. It was about accountability. Nancy's arrogance wavered, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. And then, for the first time, she looked unsure. A hushed tension filled the grocery store. The subtle beeping of registers and the rustling of shopping bags had all but faded into the background. Nancy's face remained frozen in an expression of disbelief, her mouth slightly open as if trying to grasp what had just happened. Sophie's phone screen was still glowing, the recording captured in perfect clarity. The accusation, the condescending remarks, the dismissive attitude, it was all there. "You're bluffing," Nancy scoffed, though her voice wavered slightly. "You can't just post that." Sophie arched an eyebrow, tilting the phone slightly in her hand. "Why not? Everything you said, everything you did, it's right here. The world deserves to see how you treat people." Melanie watched the scene unfold, torn between a mother's instinct to protect her daughter and the quiet, undeniable pride swelling in her chest. Sophie had done what she herself had spent years avoiding, standing up in the face of injustice, refusing to let it slide. Nancy's eyes darted to the small but growing group of customers who were now fully invested in the confrontation. She was outnumbered, and for the first time, the smugness in her expression flickered into something else. Uncertainty. She knew the power of social media. Stories like this spread like wildfire, and no amount of backtracking could erase what had been caught on video. Nancy stammered, her gaze flicking toward the store manager's office at the far end of the store. "This is being blown way out of proportion." Sophie let out a humorless laugh. Is this just what happens when people like you finally get called out?" More customers were whispering now, some pulling out their phones, possibly recording as well. A few younger shoppers were already typing furiously, no doubt composing tweets or TikTok captions about what they had just witnessed. Then, from the back of the store, a new voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" A tall man in his early 50s, wearing a crisp dress shirt and name tag that read Manager, Paul Sanderson, approached with a furrowed brow. He had clearly sensed the disturbance and come to investigate. Nancy immediately turned to him, relief washing over her face. "Paul, thank goodness. These two are causing a scene over nothing." Paul's eyes narrowed as he looked at Nancy, then at Sophie and Melanie. His gaze shifted to the phones in people's hands, the silent but obvious proof that something bigger was happening. Sophie wasted no time. "She accused my mom of stealing," she said bluntly. Then she started making snide remarks. "We have it all recorded." Paul inhaled sharply, the weight of the moment settling on him. He knew exactly what this meant. He had been in management long enough to recognize when a situation was spiraling out of control. His jaw tightened. "Nancy, is this true?" Nancy's face reddened. She faltered, glancing at the crowd. "I was doing my job, Paul." Paul sighed, rubbing his temple before looking at Melanie. His voice softened. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize if you were treated unfairly. I can assure you that this is not how we want our customers to feel when they shop here." Melanie crossed her arms. "Apologies don't erase what happened, and they definitely don't erase a pattern of behavior." Nancy scoffed, but Paul's sharp look silenced her. Sophie, sensing an opportunity to drive the point home, turned the phone screen toward Paul. "Do you want to see the video?" Paul hesitated. He didn't need to. He already knew what he would find. Instead, he straightened his posture and turned back to Nancy. "Go my office. Now." Nancy's mouth opened in protest. "But Paul." "Now, Nancy." Her eyes darted around the store, as if silently begging someone to back her up. But no one spoke. The customers who had witnessed everything, the same one she had once assumed wouldn't care, stood silently, watching her downfall unfold in real time. Nancy swallowed hard, then turned on her heel and stalked off toward the office, her face burning with humiliation. As soon as she disappeared, Paul exhaled and turned back to Melanie and Sophie. "I want to make this right," he said sincerely. "Would you be willing to sit down with me so we can address this properly?" Melanie considered him for a moment. She had heard these words before. Promises of addressing issues, of looking into the matter. Empty assurances that never resulted in real change. But before she could decide, Sophie spoke up. "We'll sit down," she said, "but not so you can smooth things over. We want to know what happens next. Because if this is just going to be another let's sweep it under the rug conversation, don't waste our time." Paul's eyes flickered with something almost like admiration. He gave a small nod. "I understand. Let's talk." And with that, the confrontation was far from over. Because this wasn't just about one racist store clerk. This was about making sure it never happened again. The small office at the back of the store was sterile and impersonal. Gray walls, metal filing cabinets, and a single window that barely let in any light. Paul gestured toward 2 chairs across from his desk. "Please have a seat." Melanie hesitated, but eventually sat down. Sophie, however, remained standing, arms crossed, eyes locked onto the manager. "I'd rather stand," she said. Paul sighed, nodding slightly. He understood. Fair enough. Nancy sat in the farthest corner of the office, arms stiff at her sides, her face still flushed with anger and embarrassment. She looked like a child forced in a timeout, glaring at everyone as if she were the victim. Paul sat down behind his desk, folding his hands together. "Let's get straight to the point," he said. "This situation is unacceptable. Customers should never feel discriminated against in our store. And based on what I've heard, that's exactly what happened today." Nancy let out a sharp breath. "I wasn't discriminating. I was doing my job." Sophie scoffed. "Yeah? And how often does doing your job involve accusing innocent black customers of stealing?" Paul shot Nancy a warning glance. "Nancy, I've had multiple complaints about your behavior before. This isn't the first time something like this has come up." Melanie's eyebrows lifted. "Wait, so you knew she had a problem?" Paul hesitated before nodding. There have been previous reports about Nancy being rude to customers, especially customers of color. But we never had clear evidence of blatant discrimination until now. Sophie's jaw clenched. "So, you just let it continue?" Paul exhaled. "We addressed it, but clearly not strongly enough." He looked at Nancy. "And that's on me. But after today, there won't be any more second chances." Nancy sat up straighter. "Paul, you're suspended, effective immediately," Paul said firmly. Nancy's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." Paul's expression remained unreadable. "HR will be reviewing your case, and I'll be forwarding the video evidence to them." He turned towards Sophie and Melanie. "I assume you'll be sharing the recording with us?" Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll consider it." Nancy shot up from her chair, slamming her hands onto the desk. "This is ridiculous. I worked here for years. You're really going to punish me because these two—" Paul stood as well, his voice sharp and final. "That's exactly why I'm punishing you, Nancy." Nancy's face twisted in frustration, but for the first time, there was also fear in her eyes. Paul motioned toward the door. "Please leave." For a moment, it seemed like Nancy would argue. But then, she let out a sharp breath, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the office without another word. The door slammed behind her, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Paul turned back to Melanie and Sophie. "I know this doesn't undo what happened," he admitted, "but I want you to know that I take this seriously, and I'm willing to do more to make sure it doesn't happen again." Melanie studied him carefully. "Like what?" Paul leaned forward. "Starting immediately, all employees will undergo mandatory bias training. Not some surface-level, check-the-box training, but real education about racial profiling and customer treatment. Sophie's arms remained crossed. And Paul didn't hesitate. And we'll be reviewing our hiring practices to ensure diversity in our leadership. That's one of the biggest ways we can prevent this from happening again. Melanie was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Sophie, however, still wasn't satisfied. That's a start, she admitted. But let's be real. If we hadn't recorded this, nothing would have happened. Nancy would still be at that register tomorrow, treating people like criminals just because of their skin color. Paul didn't argue. You're right. Sophie blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. Paul exhaled. The truth is, companies only change when they're forced to. And that's exactly what you did today. You forced us to face it. That's why I'm asking for your input. What do you think should happen next? Melanie and Sophie exchanged glances. This was a rare moment, an actual invitation to influence change. Sophie took a deep breath before speaking. You want to prove you're serious? She looked him directly in the eyes. Make this public. Not just to us, not just to your employees. Post a public statement about what happened here today and the changes you're implementing. Own up to it. Paul's expression didn't waver. Done. Melanie raised an eyebrow. Just like that. Paul nodded. Just like that. I'll personally make sure it's addressed in a public forum. Sophie narrowed her eyes slightly. And what about Nancy? Paul hesitated. HR will determine whether she stays employed here or not. But given the evidence, I wouldn't be surprised if she's terminated. Sophie inhaled slowly, processing everything. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than she had expected. Melanie finally spoke. This shouldn't have happened in the first place. Paul nodded solemnly. No, it shouldn't have. A long silence followed. Then Melanie stood. We'll be watching to see if you keep your word. Paul extended his hand. I wouldn't expect anything less. Melanie hesitated, then shook it. Sophie, however, simply gave him a small nod. Good luck. With that, mother and daughter turned and walked out of the office, knowing that this was just one battle in a much bigger fight. But this time they had won. The air outside the grocery store felt different. Crisp. Lighter, somehow. As Melanie and Sophie walked toward their car, a few customers who had witnessed the confrontation gave them small nods of acknowledgement. Some even murmured words of support. That was incredible, a young woman said as she passed. Thank you for standing up to her. Sophie gave a small smile, but didn't say much. She was still processing everything. Melanie unlocked the car, slid into the driver's seat, and exhaled deeply. Well, she said, gripping the steering wheel. That was a lot. Sophie climbed in beside her, placing her phone on the dashboard. Yeah. A long pause stretched between them. Then Melanie chuckled softly, shaking her head. I cannot believe you pulled out your phone like that. Sophie smirked. You raised me to be fearless. Melanie sighed, a mix of pride and exhaustion in her expression. Yeah, but I also raised you to be careful. Sophie turned to her mother, her face serious now. We can't afford to be careful, Mom. Not when this kind of thing keeps happening. Melanie looked at her daughter, truly looked at her, and saw something she hadn't fully grasped before. Sophie wasn't just reacting to this moment. She was reacting to every moment before it. Every time she had watched her mother stay quiet to keep the peace. Every time she had heard stories of injustice, but felt powerless to change anything. But today was different. Today they had done something, and the world had noticed. By the time they got home, Sophie's video had already been shared thousands of times. A simple caption accompanied it. This happened to my mom today. This happens to Black people every day. Enough is enough. The comments poured in. This is disgusting. That employee needs to be fired immediately. This is why we record everything. Keep exposing them. Props to the daughter for standing up. We need more people like her. I've shopped at that store before. If they don't make serious changes, I won't be going back. By midnight, news outlets had picked up the story. The grocery store chain released a statement acknowledging the incident and confirming that Nancy had been placed on indefinite suspension pending an internal review. They reiterated their commitment to bias training and workplace diversity. Sophie read the statement aloud while sitting on the couch next to her mom. Wow, she muttered. They actually did it. Melanie shook her head, unimpressed. They did it because they had no choice. Sophie sighed, setting down her phone. At least it's something. Melanie turned to her. Do you think it'll change anything? Sophie hesitated before answering. I don't know. The next morning, Melanie sat at the kitchen table, staring at her coffee. She hadn't slept much. Sophie entered the kitchen, phone still buzzing with notifications. We're at 500,000 views, she said, sliding into a chair. Melanie nodded, but didn't respond. Sophie frowned. Mom. Melanie looked up, her expression unreadable. I keep thinking about all the times this happened before. When I was younger. When I was your age. When I was just trying to exist in spaces where people assumed I didn't belong. Sophie's fingers curled around her phone. And you just took it? Melanie let out a sad chuckle. I had to. Back then, we didn't have cameras in our pockets. We didn't have social media to hold people accountable. All we had were our voices. And most of the time, no one was willing to listen. Sophie swallowed hard. But they're listening now. Melanie reached across the table, placing her hand over Sophie's. That's because of your generation. You're making people listen. Sophie held her mother's gaze. It's not enough. Melanie nodded. No, it's not. But it's a start. Over the next few weeks, the conversation continued to spread. The grocery store chain followed through on their promise, releasing updates about the training they were implementing. They even invited a diversity and inclusion expert to review their hiring and promotion practices. Nancy? She was officially fired. Sophie and Melanie didn't celebrate it. This was never about one person. This was about something bigger. And it wasn't over. One evening, as they sat together watching the news, Melanie turned to Sophie. You know, I always thought I had to pick my battles. Sophie raised an eyebrow. And now? Melanie smiled. Now I realize that sometimes you don't pick the battle. Sometimes it finds you. And when it does, you have to stand your ground. Sophie leaned back into the couch, a small smirk on her lips. Guess we make a pretty good team, huh? Melanie squeezed her hand. Yeah, we do. And with that, they knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice never ends. But as long as people are willing to stand up, speak out, and refuse to be silent, change is always possible.